I am going to be talking to you about my work as a vocational rehabilitation counselor with the Kentucky Office of Vocational Rehabilitation Blind Services. My office is here in Covington, and I've been with the agency for about 14 and a half years. I was with the agency when we were the Kentucky Office for the Blind before the merge in October of 2018, when we became one agency with the Office of Vocational Rehab. So with that, it's been a very interesting time frame. It's been a lot of changes, things that have been very challenging in how we work with one another as staff, because we do now serve all disabilities and not just those that are blind or visually impaired. But for me personally, I am the only blind service vocational rehabilitation counselor in 10 counties here in Northern Kentucky. So I do have a wide band of counties that I do serve, as well as 33 different schools, high schools that I do serve here in Northern Kentucky. So with that being the case, it does sometimes feel a little overwhelming. And on these slides, Steve, I did send a link, I think, to you on a handout for this. I didn't know if you wanted to place that in the chat. So if anybody wanted to have that access to the slides I'll be showing.
I will post that in the
Okay.
chat, Larry. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Steve. So Beck said a little bit about me as he was closing out his session, but I have been a member of the Kentucky Suicide Prevention Group since 2008. In 2010, I became a Certified Q.P.R. Suicide Prevention Gatekeeper Trainer. And since 2010, I've done well over 200 trainings with several thousand people probably trained as gatekeepers. With that being said, one of the goals I've always had as a trainer is trying to train every single person that I can come in contact with on the 3 steps of question, persuade, and refer, and how to implement that, not if we come across someone that may be suicidal, but when we come across someone that may be suicidal. So with that being the case, and doing all of these trainings, in December of this past year in 2020, during a lot of what was still going on with the pandemic, I did become a master trainer, one of the few master trainers here in Kentucky that I can now train trainers in the QPR technique through the QPR Institute in Spokane, Washington. But also over the years, I've done a lot of different work and studies, trainings on different aspects of suicide and suicide prevention, attempters of suicide, as well as those that are survivors of suicide loss. So on this slide, as well as this next one, it does go into some of those things. But the one thing I do want to bring up, not only am I a vocational rehabilitation counselor, I am also a survivor of severe depression, general anxiety with panic attacks. And this is something that, even though I do take medication today, I have it to a point that I do still do my work. I still live life I try to thrive as much as possible. And one of my biggest passions I do have, and probably one of the biggest overall in my life, outside of my faith and my family, is suicide prevention and being able to work in bereavement. I do 2 different bereavement groups at my church in Burlington, Kentucky, with Grief Share and the Christian Survivors of Suicide Loss support group. So with that being the case, I take my background of what I've experienced with my own mental health struggles and bring that to the table as I work with others. But my first loss to suicide came on Thanksgiving Day in 1986, when I lost a dear friend of mine to suicide, and no one wanted to talk about it. No one discussed anything about what went on, what led up to that decision, how the family was affected by this suicide loss. Even though it was a small town, no one reached out to this family. And since 1986, for a lot of years, I really struggled with that and wondered why suicide loss was treated so much differently than any other loss, and why communities didn't come together to help families. So in the midst of all of this, I did, as I stated, come in contact with Kentucky Suicide Prevention Group and realized there were people out there that talked openly and would share with one another stories and resources and things that helped them through their losses. Because many people in suicide prevention has also went through suicide loss. And so with that, that's what I bring to this training here, this presentation today. My email address is right here on this slide with larry.mcnabb@ky.gov. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me. Just send me an email with that email address and let me know if you would like to do the QPR Gatekeeper training, or as Becky mentioned, if you are interested in becoming a trainer in the QPR technique, that we could work together in making that happen as well. We are very fortunate to have someone like Beck that is trained, has helped with grants to help train so many people right here in Kentucky to be trainers in suicide prevention. So that is my email address, larry.mcnabb@ky.gov. So we look at what has happened during this pandemic. What has happened with our mental health? We know that there's been a lot of struggles. We know that each one of us has taken a hit to some degree on how we lived our lives, how we're coming out of this pandemic, how we're moving forward. And when we see some of the things that's happened, we have seen some encouraging things. And when it comes to suicide, we saw in 2019 that the suicide rates had a decrease for the first time in 15 years. But and it may be decreased again in 2020. We haven't seen the numbers. Those numbers hasn't been released yet, and probably won't be until sometime at the end of January of 2022. But when we look at that, we see that more has been done, as Beck has been talking about with the 988 in his session. The new crisis line, National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, will be put in place in July of 2022. We know that there's been a lot of work, a lot of efforts put in by each state trying to prepare for this and making it to where those that are struggling, those that may be suicidal, can reach out and contact someone within their own state and as much as possible their own area that can help them with getting the resources and helps they need if they are thinking about suicide. And we know that with legislation, there's been more and more funding put into mental health awareness as more celebrities, more entertainers have come out and talked about their own struggles. We've seen that there has been an increase in us talking openly about depression and mental health, as well as suicide. So that's been some of the good news that we have seen. But as we have also seen the bad side of things, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, we saw a great increase in some places during COVID where people were really struggling just to get through another day. We saw that this largest increase of the impact that our mental health took during this COVID pandemic was with teens and young adults. Many of them still struggling greatly with their mental health. And so we actually had a pandemic within a pandemic. And this wasn't just the United States, but we saw this globally in a lot of places. And then we saw that there was an increase in overdoses during the pandemic, people being left alone, isolated from others, a time that if you're using any type of drug, whether it's prescription and overusing it, or you're using illicit drugs, you didn't have that person or people around you when you were using that. And many times when you overdosed, there was no one there to reach out and get help. So then we saw suicide rates right now, where we're at now, usually 12 to 18 months after a crisis, we see suicide rates increase. We're in that time frame now that we're seeing more and more suicides come to surface, and more people, as Beck mentioned, 125, 145 survivors for each suicide loss. That is something that impacts a great number of us. And many studies show that most, if not all of us, at one time or another has thought about suicide. So why do we not talk about it? Why is it still something that has a stigma or it's taboo in certain places right here in the United States? So we still got a long ways to go as we try to do more in this field. Talking to you about the work that I do and relating it to the mental health and suicide prevention. What I want you to do is imagine that you're an employer. You're in charge of hiring the next person for a job that's become available in your job place. And as you're looking at two candidates that seem on paper to be your ideal candidate, and you start moving forward with the process, sorry about that. But as you move through that process, you realize when they're standing before you, as you get ready to interview them, you realize that one of these two candidates has a white cane. One of the candidates have a white cane, and this white cane, as you see this person walking, they have this white cane out in front of them, moving side to side. What are some of the things that you're thinking as you are thinking about these two candidates? And on paper, they look pretty much identical in many ways, and both of them seem to be a great asset. So what are some of the things you're thinking about as an employer? Do you look at each one of these candidates and still say, you know what, I'm more focused and concerned about their abilities and not the disability that I openly see with this one person, with this one individual that has a white cane? Do you really look at it from that perspective? Or is there already a bias that you have set up to say, wait a minute, I don't know if I really can work with someone that's blind. Would it be a safety issue? Would it be something that could cause harm to this individual working here and could be a liability, if you will, for our business? Or is it someone that you truly do say, you know what, I do think that everybody deserves an opportunity to show what they're able to do. And if these two candidates are both similar, I'm just as open to hire one as the other. So when we look at that, let's stop for a moment and we say, what can be done? We have an individual that has an obvious disability right here in front of us. So in the midst of everything that we just talked about with the pandemic, with people struggling with their mental health, now we have an individual that has another barrier. And that barrier is this individual has little to no vision and needs a white cane for their mobility. When we look at that, we need to realize, first of all, there is a great website for employers and all to go to and check out what kind of accommodations may be needed for someone in this situation. That you start planning that. On this slide here, you see that askjan.org is a website with the Job Accommodation Network that can take whatever you type in as the disability and shows you possible accommodations that may be needed in your workplace. Many of these accommodations are not as much or near as much as a lot of employers may think. So a little accommodation here or there, or working with an agency, and the next one with the Kentucky Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, you can work with our agency and work with that person to be able to get those accommodations. So when we look at this picture, we start thinking, wow, you know, if I knew that these things existed as an employer, this would be very helpful for me to know, because so many people with disabilities really are not addressed the same way. They have a closed door in many cases. People aren't as open to want to hire them. So when we look at these two individuals, what if I tell you that that second individual had bipolar, that they struggled with bipolar? Obviously, that would be more of an invisible battle. You didn't see it, but it's still there. And we have to realize that in this slide here, there's different types of bipolar. There is different ways that this condition, this mental health disorder, affects individuals based on the type of bipolar that they have. And this slide comes from the Mayo Clinic. So when we look at that and we realize, oh, wait a minute, I'm probably going to need some accommodations or some adjustments have to be made for me to hire the other person now that I have this information. So when we look at individuals, do we really look at what they bring to the table, or do we let their appearance determine how we move forward? This is a word that many of us has a hard time saying. I bring it up in training, but I'll bring it up here for you here today. When we have trouble saying the word died, death, dying, imagine how much more so we might have problems saying this word out loud, suicide. Having it in a conversation, having it in front of other people as we talk about the reality that we live in. I got that reality again this morning, hearing that a coworker that I recently talked to on Zoom is no longer here. She took her life by suicide yesterday. That is something that we realize that so many people, even in our circle of work, family, friends, are being hit by suicide. What I want to do right now is I want you to practice it with me, okay? We're going to count to 3. And when we do, I want everybody in here to say this word out loud to wherever you're sitting. 1, 2, 3. Suicide. How did that word make you feel as you said it? Is it something that made you sad that we have to say this word? Is it guilt? Maybe you've had someone close to you that has died by suicide, and you know that you have that guilt, or you have anger because you thought maybe I should have done more, but I didn't. So when we look at these ways that we're affected by it, and like I said earlier, that many, if not all of us at one time or another has thought about suicide, whether it's a fleeting moment or it's become chronic and we think about it on a regular basis and it lingers on and on. We know that it's something that many of us, if not all of us, understands to a certain degree what it's like to think that something's overwhelming and I cannot go another day feeling so overwhelmed, hurting, whether it's physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, or all of these together. It is still real. It is perceived by that person to be overwhelming. What I perceive to be overwhelming in my life may not be perceived as overwhelming in your life. What you perceive to be overwhelming in your life may not be so for me. So how big of a problem do we have when it comes to suicide? And this slide here, it gives us some of those numbers with over 47,511 documented deaths in the United States in 2019, not accounting for those that possibly died by other means. It was undetermined. They died in a car accident, but was it really a car accident? Looking at the circumstances, as we saw earlier in our first session, a very small number of those that died by suicide will leave a suicide note to indicate that was their intentions. So even if you died by an overdose, I've had parents and loved ones ask me, do you think my loved one may have taken his or her life? I would say, well, did they leave a suicide note to indicate their intention? And most of the time I would hear, no, they didn't. So unfortunately, the only person that could answer that question is no longer here to answer that question. But when we look at attempts, there's approximately 25 attempts they estimate. There's probably more than that per each suicide. For all of the population. So when we look at 25 attempts, that's breaking down with the younger population, teens and younger adults. We see that that's 100 to 200 attempts for every suicide. But with 85 and older, we see that there's 4 attempts for every suicide. We see that males are by far, they do take their life by suicide, 3.5 to 4 times more likely, but a female is about 3 times more likely to think about suicide, to attempt that suicide, 3 times more likely to attempt that suicide. So when you think about that, you look at methods, way that someone tried to end their life, and you say, well, that's why males are so much higher in taking their life by suicide because of the method. But in 2018, we saw that the leading cause of suicide loss for females was handguns. So how much longer does it take before we start seeing these numbers come closer together? And now we have more suicide deaths than car crashes. And it's the second leading cause of death for those that are 15 to 24. Here in Kentucky, we see some of those numbers in 2019, still above the national average. So when we look at these numbers, you're almost 3 times more likely to take your own life than have someone take your life in a homicide. So when we look at those numbers, what do we hear most about? Homicide, obviously. In the news and the media, you hear about shootings that go on, people dying by the hands of someone else, but we don't hear that much at all, even in our local media, newspapers, about that person locally that died by suicide or suicided. So when we look at it, we have to look at this statement right here and realize we can't be silent. No matter who you're working with, whether it's disabilities or if it's the general population, I am a silent killer. I am indiscriminate and I can strike without warning. I not only kill, but I destroy the lives of those that are left behind. I cause chaos and trauma. Those that have not come into contact with me are frightened to utter my name for fear I will touch their lives. They don't realize that the only way I can be stopped is to talk about me. I am depression. I am suicide. Raise that awareness so we can stop the stigma. The only way that depression, mental health disorders, suicide wins out is if we keep staying silent and we realize we can't do that anymore. The person most likely to prevent us from taking our own life is someone we already know. And this comes from Dr. Paul Quinnett, that founded the QPR Institute. Dr. Quinnett says that the person that's likely to prevent us from taking our own life is someone we already know. Because we have more of an impact in our own communities and for those around us than I would going into your communities or talking to you about suicide prevention or some kind of a training. You have the bigger impact because people already know you and you have built up that respect and that familiarity. And so when we think about how important my story is, your story, we need to realize it's important for those that we work with as well. The struggles we have in our life might be more of an invisible disability, but we still have struggles ourselves that even the people we're working with that has physical disabilities or other disabilities also looks at that and says, you know what? I'm glad you shared your story because I know that through what you're going through, even though I don't see it the way people may see my disability or disabilities, it's very real. And you're able to not just survive it, but thrive despite it. So when we look at who can it happen to, I bring this one up in the training as well. And it says, I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on the earth. Whether I shall ever be better, I cannot tell. I awfully forebode I shall not. To me, to remain as I am is impossible. I must die or be better, it appears to me. And when we look at that in 1841, that Abraham Lincoln used this quote, we realize that even then, he knew the dire straits that he was in. He knew that he had to get the help that he needed to get that support around him, or he was going to die, because he could not continue on the way he was going. And that's where we're at even today. If you keep going down that dark and cold path and not realizing that there's people around you that care, you have a lot more people that care about you, and the people you're working with have more people that care about them. If we just really were able to ask, how many people really care about me? Because that's the core question we all have. Do you care? So when Abraham Lincoln had this happen to him with depression, we realize that it can happen to any of us. It can happen to any of us. We need to recognize it in ourselves and in others, those that we're working with, and realize that when we get to a point, we need to ask. You know, some people, when they're as depressed as you seem to be, think about suicide. Are you thinking about it? That's one way of asking that question. So when we look at a VR counselor, someone like myself, I am also a certified vocational rehabilitation counselor. Basically, in our code of ethics, it says to us as counselors, in the values and principles near the beginning of the CRC Code of Ethics Manual, we see the comments of the code through our values as vocational rehabilitation counselors. These values inform principles. They represent one important way of expressing a general ethical commitment that becomes more precisely defined and action-oriented when expressed as a principle. The fundamental spirit of caring and respect with which the code is written is based upon 6 principles of ethical behavior. And with these 6 codes that we have as VR counselors, as certified VR counselors, they fit in with what we're talking about with suicide prevention. When we look at these 6, here's 3 of them. Autonomy, to respect the rights of clients to be self-governing within their social and cultural framework, helping them to become independent thinkers, help them to become more independent and advocating for themselves, to say, I have a disability that I need accommodations in my workplace to be accessible, but I also bring abilities. And those abilities is what I want you to focus on as employers. So as counselors, we want to bring that up to say, we want to respect that right, that they want to be self-governing within their social and cultural framework. That goes along with helping them to fit in to the population around them. Beneficence, we see that to do good to others, to promote the well-being of clients. So we are promoting good and the well-being of our clients. That is obviously something we want to look at the whole picture of our consumers, the holistic part, not just that they're blind or visually impaired for myself, but what else is going on? What's going on at home? What's going on with their mental health? Many times it's their mental health that's more invisible, that's the biggest struggle than their vision loss. So we really have to address what is best for them overall and moving forward. Then there's a fidelity to be faithful, to keep promises and honor the trust placed in rehabilitation counselors. My consumers trust me to make decisions that affects their lives. We have to be able to keep promises when we say we can do something or we can't do something, that we know that we really can't do something. But we need to honor that trust that they put in with us. And this goes for other vocations as well. You have your own code of ethics, and fidelity is one of those that is in about anyone's code of ethics. So when we look at these 3, we're saying, yeah, they go hand in hand with what our topic is. Justice, to be fair in the treatment of all clients, to provide appropriate services to all, not showing a bias or a disregard to someone, because when we see that individuals with disabilities are often underemployed. They're overlooked. Many times they're neglected altogether. Even though we have the Americans with Disability Act that says you can't do that as an employer to discriminate against individuals based only on their disability, then we need to realize, but employers can be very creative on why they don't hire you. And when it comes down to it, how many times is it because there's a difference with them? They do have a disability that's being looked at more closely than their abilities. Non-malfeasance, to do no harm to others. We don't ever want to do harm to others. Their safety is the primary thing that I look at for any of my consumers. I wouldn't want to put someone in a workplace where I know they're going to be in jeopardy with their safety because of their vision loss, or possibly even other disabilities they have even outside of their vision loss. So we need to make sure that we do no harm to those that we're working with. And then the veracity, to be honest, be upfront, be truthful. We're in a time where it seems like that's almost something that it's outdated. We have our own agendas so often, but for the people we're working with, where they're putting so much into trusting us, we need to be honest and to share with them what can be done and how we can reach that. And if there's things that can't be done, let's discuss that and look at other options that may tie into what we say. Well, you can't be a pilot if you're visually impaired, but what do you like about airplanes? Maybe we can look at some of those things. So there is some things that we all need to look at, but these 6 code of ethics that I have as a vocational rehab counselor is something that fits with all of us in our workplace. Disability pride, live on. Disability awareness, and that is the little lightning bolt for disability pride. Even though there's not a Disability Pride Month that is recognized nationally yet, some states are starting to move in that direction so we can have a Disability Pride Month, a disability month where we can recognize, to be proud of who you are as an individual and not discriminate against them or show a bias to them because of that disability. So that's a little bit about what that Disability Pride Month is in July, but I'll let that be something you look at later for the lack of time that we have here today. But when we look at disability versus without disability, here are some things that has shown in some studies recently over the last few years. There's not many studies when we correlate suicide and disabilities. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. For Beck and you guys that are doing a lot of research out there in the state, maybe consider focusing on some disabilities, some specific disabilities, how it affects your mental health, and thus possibly leading more individuals to think that suicide's an option. We already know that many disabilities causes an increase for someone to be suicidal. But looking at this slide here, let's read through these and just see how alarming our society still looks at disabilities. In a recent study from Utah State University and Mississippi State University, it found that most people, including people with disabilities, say it is more acceptable for a person with a disability to kill themselves than a person without a disability. Wow. When did we start putting a disability on the quality or the importance of an individual? Even people with disabilities are thinking in their mindset, I'm not as worthy as someone else. Societal perception is often stating that disability is worse than death. How alarming is that? Kentucky is in the top 5 states for disability rates, and Eastern Kentucky has the highest rates in our state. We have a lot of individuals that are considered to have a disability right here in our Commonwealth of Kentucky. But how are we working with that population and helping them to become more included into what we're doing, so they're not excluded from work and the quality of life that we all take for granted when we don't have those disabilities. Did you know that in the United States, only 42% of working age individuals with visual disabilities are employed, and many are underemployed in low-wage jobs? Close to 50%, 42% are all that is employed, and many of those are underemployed. So when we look at that, we see that there is so much work that needs to be done in this field. According to Disabled World, 33% of 20-year-old workers will become disabled before reaching retirement age. Over 1 billion people, around 15% of the world's population, has some form of disability. There are approximately 3.3 million wheelchair users in the United States, and the number is increasing every year. Rates of disability are increasing due to world population aging and increases in chronic health conditions. And according to the CDC morbidity and mortality report in 2018, it says 1 in 4 US adults, 61 million, have a disability that impacts major life activities. 93 to 95% of people with disabilities worldwide do not use a wheelchair, though the universal disability symbol is a wheelchair. You notice that in parking lots, places you go for parking, the symbol that's used to say this is for those with disabilities is a wheelchair. CDC also reports that suicide rates among our nation's youth have increased 56% since 2007. It is the second leading cause of death among individuals 15 to 24. Data shows that youth with disabilities, however, are 4 times more likely to think about suicide than their non-disabled peers. 4 times. So we know that those with disabilities are thinking that things look hopeless. No one cares. People with disabilities and suicide awareness. The fact is, research on disability and depression has consistently shown that when people with disabilities report dissatisfaction in their lives, they're not nearly as concerned with things such as reliance on machines or medications as they are with their relationships, financial security, or difficulties while at work. Despite this social message repetitively presented is that life with a form of disability is miserable. And when the people around us believe that without questioning it, it may become very hard for people with disabilities to think anything different. Through this, people with disabilities come to internalize oppressive images, and after that happens, it becomes very difficult for people with disabilities to hope for something better in their lives. At this point, suicide also becomes an issue. That hopelessness, a little here, a little of that. You see how it snowballs with people neglecting to acknowledge you, to do things that will give you a step up in the world, just like we all have that right. Some people are treated as if they don't have that right. And unfortunately, disabilities is one of those. Considering the negative social messaging concerning disability, we hear almost daily. It is not surprising that people at times consider suicide after acquiring a disability, a sudden onset of a disability. In fact, a number of the factors that are considered to be important in evaluating suicide potential, such as social inclusion, financial stability, and freedom of mobility, consistently present challenges for people with disabilities. It is amazing that even though 18.7% of all non-institutionalized civilians in the United States experience a form of disability, they remain nearly invisible when it comes to issues of suicide. There again, where's the research? Where's your studies? Where is people working on these areas to show they are important too? Disability in relation to suicide is something that is very hard to find statistically statistics on, and it is not a new phenomenon. The highest rate of suicide is reported among study populations of people with multiple sclerosis, followed by those with spinal cord injury, and then people with intellectual disabilities. Suicide among people with disabilities is a complex, pressing public health concern, as it is other populations. It is a concern, and it's very complex. Each suicide is brought on from different angles, and what led someone to think that that was the only solution they had left. So disabilities has those same unique things about them as well. Suicide rates are much higher among people with, as I said, with spinal cord and multiple sclerosis than the general population. So when we look at another part of the overall population with disabilities at risk, include people with forms of intellectual disabilities, in which it seems that rates of suicide risk are higher than the general population as well, even though suicide rates appear to be lower. So there again, there's some uncertainty with certain populations because there hasn't been enough studies to show what correlations and where is the ratio of those that may be suffering or struggling or able, as they're able in many ways. Many times they're labeled with disabilities, but they truly have abilities that many times the way that society treats them, we realize that that correlates with that hopelessness that comes with thinking that suicide is an option. So when we look at some of these issues, people with disabilities live lives that are just as worthy as the lives of non-disabled persons. Why do we not give them the worth and the dignity as we do anyone else? They have a worth. They have experience that they can share with us. Their stories inspire us to show that we aren't limited in many ways. And just because you have obstacles in your path, you can still rise above those obstacles and accomplish great things. Anytime you watch the Paralympics, you watch athletes from around the world accomplish such feats that amazes us. But why does it amaze us? Because they work hard to accomplish the goals that they see when they get those medals, when they accomplish those goals in their sports, in life, and the vocational goals that they set for themselves. So when we look at this, it is imperative that organizations work with crisis intervention on understanding disability as a social issue. We need that to be one of the priorities as we move forward, because so many people are affected by disabilities of some sort. Communities need to stop tolerating the notion that people with disabilities have a reason to die, and instead become active partners with the disability community to create a world that is both inclusive and accessible. Work with your local governments, work with your state governments. That's where you have the biggest impact. Work there first. And then when people see what's going on in your community and your state, it'll branch out into other states around the nation and maybe even become more global. So raising awareness about suicide will make the disability community visible while bringing people together so they can prevent unnecessary suffering and pain that goes on with our individuals that have a disability. Keep an eye on our time here. So when we look at visual, this is from two different studies that have been done recently, but it basically puts an emphasis on how much vision loss. On this first one we have here, the results that it showed, it says of the 91 cases of suicide, it uses committed by the visually impaired, which I will educate you in this group today. I would challenge you to help us to eliminate that phrase, commit suicide. Commit comes from the days when it was considered a crime for individuals to attempt a suicide, no matter what their mental health disorder might have been or how tragic or struggling someone may be going through, it was considered a crime. You committed a crime. So we have held on to that word commit suicide in our media, in our newspapers, in our public for long enough. We need to start replacing it by died by suicide, died from the effects of your mental health. It can become terminal, like cancers in some people. And so when we look at how we phrase things, we're already making a judgment. And for individuals in general, we see that sometimes that builds walls. So when we look at that, start educating ourselves, each one of us, because that's who we're responsible for, on not saying that phrase, commit suicide. Find another way to say that. Suicided is a word that I hear often in trainings. But when we look at the visually impaired, it says 63 of the 91 were by people with a WHO impaired level of low vision, and 28 by people categorized under the 3 and 5 category. So visual impairment in both groups, males dominated. Visual impairment was diagnosed at a younger age in blind persons compared with persons in the low vision category. In blind persons, suicide deaths peaked amongst the 40 to 64 years of age, but in the persons with low vision, most of the suicide deaths involved 65 and older. So it really affects the older population, the 40 to 64 and the 65 and older. The only age group that saw an increase in the 2019 studies was the 85 and older, becoming the highest population per population for an age group. So when we look at that second one, it says that there was this study there, it was compared with no visual impairments, severe visual impairments. They were significantly associated with suicidal ideations. Moderate and severe visual impairment were significant associated with a 2.22 and an 11.50 times higher odds of suicide attempts, respectively. Disability, poor rated health, mobility, and loneliness explained 14%. So when we looked at all of this together, we see that coming with a disability, we also see a higher rate for poverty. We see a higher rate of isolation from society, becoming more lonely, being isolated because you can't get out and mobilize like we do in the general population. So there's many factors that are factored in when you do studies, but still these studies are very few and they kind of are confusing on how you interpret them. As I was reading them, you're probably thinking, I don't know what any of that means. Even looking at them, you may say, I still don't know what those results are showing. But the bottom line is that visual impairments do cause a fear. People to think, how do I still live? How do I still have a productive life when I have little to no vision? So when we look at disability, we also have to realize being able to receive counseling and receiving grieving support can be the simplest and most significant piece of therapeutic advice a person with a disability can receive. It is a loss. You have lost something very significant. For many of us, one of our biggest fears we have is the fear of losing our vision. So imagine if you actually do lose your vision. How overwhelming and fearful would you be? Counseling and grieving support can help an individual with a disability to focus on what he or she needs to do to become functional members of his or her family and in turn society. Having thoughts of suicide after becoming disabled does not make you weak. You're not feeding into the cycle of ableism. When you have those thoughts that I don't know what to do, can I do anything? If someone can't help lead me down that right path to say there are many things that can be done, one study years ago showed that 80% of all jobs can be done by someone completely blind with the right accommodations. But many that are struggling with their vision and have a disability, an ADA disability based on their vision loss, aren't being told that. They're told, okay, my life's over now. But the computer world has made it accessible because you have software and programs out there that speaks to you and tells you what is on the screen. Each of us who becomes disabled deserves the right to mourn our old lives. We should not feel ashamed to ask for help during this adjustment. To a degree, we're all going to mourn that loss when we have a loss of certain things that we took for granted. And all of a sudden, through circumstances that in many cases may have been out of our control, or a bad decision that caused us to be paralyzed, whatever it may be, but we have a right to mourn that the way we used to be. But we need, in the midst of our mourning, grief and mourning. Where I do 2 bereavement groups, grief is the internalizing of that loss. Mourning is being able to externally voice that loss, be able to talk to others, be in a support group where others with similar backgrounds can go through. So in her blog, Holly Bonner from Blind Motherhood says this: quadriplegia is not the worst disability in the world, but ask yourself, what is for you? Would it be losing a limb, spending your life in a wheelchair, losing your eyesight? How would you cope? How would you not mourn the life that you once had? What is the worst disability you could think of that you could have? Because there again, it's your perception of how that affects you as a person on how severe it may be. Adults with disabilities report frequent mental distress almost 5 times as often as adults without disabilities. And so there again, CDC has released this. Screen patients for mental health concerns when they especially have sudden onset of disabilities. So when we look at our mental health, we have to realize that between 1/4 and 1/3 of adults with low vision experience depression. And I've given where it came from in each one of these segments. Visual impairments may be associated with an increased risk of suicide through its indirect negative effect on health. According to a newer article, and this was 2008, eye conditions that lead to visual impairment often have psychosocial and health consequences, including impaired activities of daily living, social isolation, mental impairment, increased dependency on others, increased motor vehicle crashes, falls and fractures, depression, and poor self-rated health, according to the background information in that article. So vision loss was linked with suicidal thoughts or suicidal attempts in a new study from South Korea. We're getting a few different researches from other countries. We need to do more right here in the United States and how it is affecting our own citizens here. But we see from Dr. Rim of the Institute of Vision Research, we see that it included almost 30,000 adults who underwent eye exams between 2008 and 2012. But he made that correlation with the vision loss, the amount of vision loss that someone has. There is a correlation on how much more at risk you are for suicide. But so much that was done years ago, so much needs to be done today. The prefrontal cortex of your brain. In a new report from Yale researchers examined how the pandemic is affecting our brains. In particular, the prefrontal cortex, the front of the head, the part of the brain that is involved in decision-making, impulse control, and emotional regulation. For 44 to 66 million disadvantaged Americans, the researchers say the pandemic is exacerbating existing stressors, including financial insecurity, systemic racism, which impairs prefrontal cortexual performance that is critical for regulating emotions and coping among other functions. So, and with our youth, with our younger generation, your prefrontal cortex does not fully develop until an average age of around 25 years of age. So they're going to college, making decisions on families and marriage, and they're still trying to figure out life, going through their brains, still trying to mature. So when we as parents look at our younger individuals and we say, why don't you think about that? Why don't you think of that from my perspective? We need to put ourselves in their shoes for a moment and say, how would I view things that are going on around my kid's life, whether it's a teen or a young adult, if I were in their shoes, and realize that since their brain is still developing, I may not be thinking the same way I would as a mature adult. So young individuals, those with disabilities or without disabilities, they think of the immediate, what's in front of them right now. If they have a breakup, that can seem like the end of the world for a teen, because that relationship may have been their world as they thought it existed. They don't realize that this could have been a great decision, a great move for what may lie ahead in a few weeks, a few months, a few years down the road, when they find that right person in their life, that person that really they click with. So when you look at that, you're saying, there again, think where they're coming from. They see things in the immediate, what's before them at that very time. And this pandemic has brought a lot of that to surface, with over 75% of our youth, our teens and young adults, has said that the pandemic has substantially affected their mental health in a negative way. So some of the myths: who can stop a suicide? If they get the help they need, we all can help stop that suicide. It's not inevitable. If we recognize it, if we recognize there's a change, recognize change. That is one of the key things. If you see anyone that has changed in a good way or a negative way, positive or negative, ask why the change. Because even if you think it's good, it may be them getting things in order. So when we look at some of these myths, and for the lack of time that we have, I'm not going to go over all of these, but one of the things I want you to realize that by bringing up the question, are you thinking about suicide? You're not going to put that thought in someone's mind. As we said earlier, almost all of us, if not all of us, have thought about suicide at one time or another in our lives. So it's already there. You're not putting that thought in their mind by asking them, are you thinking about suicide right now? So asking that question can actually cause them to lower their anxiety, because they know that someone recognizes that they're struggling and are caring enough to ask them about it. And they're staying with them as they explain to them what's going on and helping them get the help that they need. So we have to realize that it is all of our business, because it's affected so many of us. We can no longer hide behind the myth that only experts can help prevent suicide. It's all of our business. We all need to find a proactive way that we can do what we can. As Beck was saying in his session, there is things that we need to start thinking about now. What can I do to get more involved? So when we look at this, there's some behavioral clues. Any suicide attempt, higher risk. If you have lethal means, higher risk. If you have co-occurring depression, moodiness, hopelessness, obviously that's putting you at a higher risk. If you see someone putting affairs in order, ask them, why are you putting things in order? And find out that maybe they're thinking about suicide that's leading them to put things in order. Giving away prized possessions, an interest or a disinterest in a religion, drug or alcohol abuse or relapse after a recovery period, unexplained anger, aggression, and irritability, being fired. These are situational clues that we went into here. being fired or expelled from school, an unwanted move, loss of any major relationship, death of a spouse, child, best friend, especially if it's by suicide, diagnosis of a serious or terminal illness, anticipated loss of security, loss of freedom, going to prison. That is a big fear for people that have never been in jail or prison. All of a sudden be looking at even a small amount of time in jail and being a burden to others for many of our seniors and that older population. So what can we do? How to ask that question? If you're ever in doubt, ask the question. You can ask it very direct. If you're comfortable with that, you can say up front, as I already have mentioned, are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about taking your life? You know, when some people are as depressed or as upset as you seem to be, they think about suicide. Are you thinking about it? Those are some direct ways you can ask, but you may not feel that comfortable. So you might need to say, are you unhappy? Are you very unhappy? Are you very unhappy lately? Are you very unhappy lately that you have thought about suicide? And you give yourself steps leading up to it, because you can't just come right out and ask that direct question. But not a way to not ask is don't ask in a negative way. You're not thinking about suicide, are you? You wouldn't do anything stupid like suicide, would you? Suicide's a dumb idea. You're not thinking about suicide, are you? These types of negative ways, when you say in a negative way, the question, are you thinking about suicide? Know that you're across the board going to get a no, because you've already made a judgment that you don't want to hear them say that they possibly are thinking about suicide. So how do you persuade someone to get help? Will you go with me? Will you let me help you get help? Will you promise me not to kill yourself until we found some help? We have heard the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 1-800-273-8255. Have that in your phone, your quick calls, your contacts. So when you need it, it's right there. As Beck has talked about and others has talked about today, the crisis text line for those that are struggling and maybe possibly thinking about suicide. You have the KY that you can text the word KY or home or start to 741-741 and have that crisis text line. But keep those numbers and resources close at hand, because you may be getting a call or someone contacting you from a different place where you don't know what the resources are, but you always have those resources that you can use, and they can direct someone to the resources that are closer to them. Don't try to get appointments with counselors, because if there's a crisis usually only lasts a few hours to a couple of days. So when they have that crisis time, they need help right then and there. They can't afford to wait a couple of months to see a counselor and make that appointment. So they need to go to a crisis place. Find out what your local places are so that they can get help in your own area. Write down 3 resources that you know, 3 people that care about you, that you trust, that you know has your back. They have your front. So they have more than just your 6. They have you all the way around covered, saying, I care. Write down 3 people that you know care about you. So if you become vulnerable and you become suicidal yourself, you already have those 3 contacts for someone to help you get that help when your mind may not be focused the way it needs to be. Your willingness to listen and to help can rekindle that hope and make all the difference. Know your resources. Know who you can refer someone to. Know how you can take someone there. That's the best way for someone to get help. If you can take them there personally, do so, but help them get that help so that they know you care and that you're there in their corner. So as we wrap up here, I gave you some bonus ones from the Mental Health America. Thank you, Marcy, and the Mental Health America people that may be on here. This is some in their booklet during the COVID times, some of our ways that we can help ourselves during the struggles that we're going through. take some time and go through these slides when Steve sends out that link. Go through those slides that's here at the end so you can actually find out how you can help your own mental health so you can be more of a help to others. So as we wrap up here today, I thank you for your time. And is there any questions that we had today, Steve?
I'm not seeing any, Larry, at least not yet. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to give to Larry? You can either put them in the chat box or if you raise your hand, I'll unmute you as well.